Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Non-Toxic Environment Show. This is your host, Andy Pace. On today's show, we have an environmental toxins educator, Lara Adler. Now, Lara was on the show, on the podcast, a few years back, and we had a great conversation about health hazards and toxins found in everyday materials that we use in our house. And really excited to have Lara back on the show today because, while our show is constantly dealing with the built environment, building materials that are used, the toxicity, the potential for mold growth, water intrusion, so forth. I really want to focus on what we bring into the home. After that healthy house is built, then what? The clothing we wear, the food we eat, the pots and pans that we use. And there really is no better person to talk to than Lara. And on today's show, we have a great conversation about plastics and PFAS chemicals and these hidden toxins, hidden health hazards found in our everyday life. But we also have a pretty frank discussion about how we need to give ourselves some grace and understand that there is no such thing as perfection. And for most of us and most of our listeners who don't have debilitating, severe health conditions where we have to avoid absolutely everything possible that could be potentially dangerous, I would say the majority of our listeners are those who are just trying to do better, just trying to do the right thing. Understand that sometimes you have to take a step backwards to take two steps forwards. And so I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. Please like this episode, click the subscribe button, make sure you get all the new episodes coming up, and share with your friends. Thank you. Lara, welcome back to the show. It's good to talk to you again.
Yeah, thanks for having me back, Andy. I love this topic. I could talk about it all day, so I'm happy to be here.
Fantastic. So, as everybody knows, my show really works on building materials, healthy homes, but, my expertise is literally the nuts and the bolts. I mean, I talk about the materials that put the home together. I'm an architectural design consultant. But the question always comes, okay, now what? We're in this house. We built this home. It's not furnished. We're not in there yet. What do we do to make sure that this huge investment of ours stays healthy? And, we thought, who's a better person to come on the show to talk to us than Lara Adler, who is the environmental toxins educator that I know and that I follow on all of your platforms. And so I want to talk about those materials mainly today.
Yeah, okay.
Now, I'm kind of curious to hear a little bit of your background too, because I think that everybody that I talk to, they always have a story, what got them into this. And I'm sure you do as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, a lot of people get into topics like this, health related, health adjacent topics, because they had some type of health challenge that kind of, made them reassess what's happening in their life and, what they're eating and exposed to. And that was not actually my story at all. I didn't have some toxic exposure that made me sick, that made me kind of open my eyes to this topic. It kind of happened, organically on its own. I kind of stumbled into the environmental health space. I say that with a asterisk to say, like, yes and not really, and I can come back to that. But I was always just a nerdy kid who was interested in food and nutrition and the environment. And after a career in another industry, I kind of turned my attention towards health coaching as a way that I could kind of flex that nerdy muscle. And so started doing work in that space. And I had clients that were really coming to me to lose weight, nothing dramatic. It was maybe like 10 or 15 pounds. But they were doing, quote unquote, all the right things. They were eating well and sleeping and exercising, and like nothing was happening for them. And so in my quest to try to figure that out, I looked into the literature on resistant weight loss. And stumbled into this field of obesogenic chemicals, which was a relatively newly coined term, which are chemicals in our environment that can lead to metabolic changes that result in weight gain or resistant weight loss. And that just kind of blew my hair back because at that point, I'd already been immersed in the wellness space and health space for well over a decade. And it felt like it was the first time that I was hearing anything about this. And so it just became fascinating to me. And then the more that I learned about the chemicals that are used in consumer materials, the more it really, frankly, just kind of pissed me off. That's the motivation, as I was just like, this is not okay, and we need to do better, and people need to know about it. So that's sort of the path that I took. But the asterisk, small print, is kind of ironic. So my dad, for the last, I want to say, 25 years, has worked as an independent consultant in the coating industry.
Hmm.
PFAS coatings, and now he's turning his attention to the ceramic coatings, thankfully. But I, spent a lot of my sort of middle school and teen years going to trade shows for housewares and cookwares trade shows, accompanying him. And, when I was in college, I was sending him articles about Teflon toxicosis, which is the name given to the condition in birds, where when they are exposed to the gases that can be emitted from overheating a nonstick pan and they die. I was emailing him those articles in the mid 90s, and he was forwarding them to the president of the company. So, like, in this weird way, I've kind of been in this space for far longer than I have been professionally.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, your story is somewhat similar to mine in that I didn't have chemical sensitivities or mold sensitivities. I mean, I got started in this in the early '90s, and back
Yeah.
then terms like chronic inflammatory response and mast cell activation didn't even exist.
Yeah.
It was environmental illness, sick building syndrome, and then multiple chemical sensitivity. But
Yeah.
it was really, I got into this because of exposure to our workers on a job site, and many of them couldn't breathe because of a coating that was being applied. But now coming full circle, it's interesting. All the people that I've talked to over the years and all the different issues, and I know you spend a lot of time and talking about endocrine disruptors and hormone disruption and thyroid issues. And 30 years ago, I was diagnosed with Hashimoto's.
Mm.
I didn't know what it was. I was,
Which is
in
less
my
common in
20s.
men than it is in women.
Right. And so I was in my 20s. I didn't think really much of it until about 3 weeks ago when I had this horrible, horrible clashing of things within my body because of an antibiotic and my thyroid. I went into a diabetic coma.
Wow, that was just a
Um,
couple weeks ago?
yes.
Wow. Well, glad
And
that you are on the other side of it, it looks like.
yeah,
So,
I mean, it was just like this blip.
yeah,
And for somebody who has never had diabetes, never had other, issues like this, it was just like this explosion. And now, a few weeks later, it's coming out. It's your thyroid. It's
yeah,
really interesting. It's as a lot of us in this industry get into it because of personal experience, my personal experience in this came much later. And
yeah,
and and so and now I again have this different view because it's a learned something I've learned on my own
sure.
now. And so a lot of the things that you deal with are these types of environmental issues and health issues because of some things that we just can't avoid.
Yeah,
And so you brought it up, the PFAS chemicals. This is one that comes now almost every call I take.
yeah,
How is this? I see it slowly starting to percolate into consumer goods in the building industry, but it's also still a red herring. It's like nobody really wants to come out and say their products are PFAS free
right.
because they don't really know for sure what type of wrong materials that they're buying.
It's a supply chain opacity issue, right? Like there's not enough transparency in the supply chain of manufactured goods. And oftentimes, PFAS chemicals are there as a contaminant, not an intended ingredient. This is where like my experience of being adjacent to my dad and understanding where PFAS are used in manufacturing, anything that's created in a mold, whether it's a golf ball or a sneaker, that mold is lined with PFAS because the item needs to be able to unmold quickly. The gears of wind turbines can have PFAS coating on them so that at the altitudes where they are, ice doesn't form on the gears and gunk up the mechanics. And so, when we're thinking about the manufacturing of goods that are moving along conveyor belts, or are if it's a liquid that's in a large 50-gallon drum, the manufacturers want to make sure that all of that liquid, just to use that example, exits the drum into whatever small containers. And the way they often do that is by coating the inside of the drum so that nothing sticks to it. And so this is where products can kind of pick up incidental PFAS exposure. It's unintentional. But again, if the manufacturers of these products aren't asking the right questions of the manufacturers, of the suppliers, and this is a major supply chain issue. It's why we have PFAS showing up in cosmetics, because those drums that the raw ingredients are shipped in are often coated in PFAS. The plastic containers that the raw materials come in are contaminating the raw ingredients. So this is part of the problem. I see a lot of, there are a couple of sort of citizen scientist folks that are doing a lot of product testing. And, we've identified, fluorine, which is an indicator of the presence of PFAS in these consumer products and these consumer products, and in contact lens solution, and in yoga pants, and in socks, and in you fill in the blank, name it. And the reality is that these chemicals are going to be found in nearly all products because of this supply chain opacity, and because of the way manufactured products move through the manufacturing cycle. So it's a real challenge, which is why, in Europe, they're looking to try to, that this movement has stalled, but to try to ban PFAS as a class of chemicals rather than individual chemicals here and there. It's just an ineffective process. So, it's a big problem.
Right. I have to imagine you have to have two willing participants in this exchange. The manufacturer has to be willing to ask the question of the supplier, and the supplier has to be willing to tell the truth. And
Yes.
I don't think either party wants to bring it up because
No.
ignorance is bliss.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, if you don't look for it, it's not there, right? And
Right.
so, we also have, the approach that the EU is taking in their move to better regulate or ban most PFAS chemistry, was what they call essential uses. So there are going to be some uses that they're like, this is essential, and we don't have a good alternative that's not a PFAS chemical to use, and so we'll grant exceptions for these cases, right? And that's complicated because everybody's going to say that their use is essential.
Hmm.
PFAS coatings are not essential in textiles. They're not essential in clothing. They're not essential in cosmetics and other makeup products. Are they maybe essential in some military applications or some medical use applications? Yeah, maybe. Everything comes with a risk and benefit.
Right.
In those examples, likely the benefit outweighs the risk, but there's no real benefit to, there's a convenience. If somebody wants, waterproof mascara or a long wear lipstick that often relies on PFAS chemistry to do those things. Yeah, consumers, the third point is consumers need to be willing to perhaps forego some of the conveniences that they're used to.
Right. And that's, I think of immediately high performance fabrics.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know, it's the fact that everybody loves having shirts and pants that don't need to be ironed and that are stain resistant and wind
yeah,
resistant. Well, how do they become that way? The
yeah.
PFAS chemicals.
Yeah, yeah, PFAS or if wrinkle resistant formaldehyde,
Right.
although that's not that commonly used anymore, but it's still present. And so yeah, I mean I think it's a major problem that is rooted in regulatory issues, and the chemical industry is one of the largest lobby groups in the world, and so they really do a lot to push for less regulation.
Mhm.
And I think that's a mistake. I think that's a
So,
mistake.
yeah. And so this kind of brings the larger question, which is how do we decide what's the important issue? And so you can look at any of, and I've been in the green building industry for 30 years. You can look at any of the green building um, points that are out there, why we do it, and come up with a whole list of, there's a whole list of pros to do it, and there's also a whole list of cons.
Sure, yeah,
And so a client comes to me and says, I want to build the healthiest home possible. Okay, well, I know exactly the materials that I'm going to recommend based upon their health issues and so forth. But then the client says, but I want to build a healthy home, but I want it also to be low carbon footprint. Okay, well
yeah,
now we're okay. So now I can't use marmoleum because it's made in the Netherlands, and so I got to
yeah,
use something that's made locally. So what's more important? And this is the
yeah,
fight we have, not fight, argument, discussion we have
yeah,
every day. But as an everyday consumer who says, I just want to buy I want to buy healthy set of pots and pans,
yeah,
there's always downsides. And so you must deal with this every single day,
yes,
having to kind of talk people off the ledge, so to speak, of, you know, if I can't find something that's perfect in every realm, I
yeah.
don't know what I'm going to do.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought that up. I actually am like the least perfectionist person in this conversation because I'm a realist, and like we all have to live in the world. And so I very much am kind of come from the place of like everybody's going to do the best that they can, and what that looks like for everybody is going to be unique to that person's circumstances, their mental bandwidth, their finances, their time that they have to allocate to finding a better product or whatever that is. And so everybody gets to decide, where the threshold is. I do think that having more knowledge about what we are exposed to or potentially exposed to through consumer goods helps people to triage,
Mm,
like what is the more important thing to focus on versus the thing that I can let go. And I think what happens is that when people step into this conversation, everything feels like a four-alarm fire,
yeah.
right? Everything feels like a big deal because they don't have the context for what matters and what matters more and what matters less. And because I'm trying to have this conversation through the lens of like what's realistic and practical, that's not going to cause us to like dramatically alter our daily lives, because if that's the requirement, no one's going to do it, right?
Mhm.
And so the recommendations that I usually give when people sort of broadly, when people are wanting to minimize their exposure, is to start with the things that are free, that don't cost them anything, right? It doesn't matter if there are maybe bigger fish to fry if that fish is really expensive, right?
Mhm.
Like
Mhm.
if like getting a organic mattress is something that you want, that's great, but that's like a $3,000 to $5,000 investment. And if somebody doesn't have that money, I don't want people to shrug their shoulders and go, well, forget it, I'm not going to do anything.
Right.
Right. And so there's a lot of small places that people can start. And, this will dovetail very well with what your side of the fence, so to speak, is improved air exchange. Just like open your windows is like the simplest intervention. I say that, yes, I live in New Mexico, and yesterday we had really bad dust storms. So don't open your windows if that's the case, because our air quality was terrible because of it. But, obviously there's exceptions. But there are small yet hugely impactful things that anybody can do to start addressing toxic exposures. It's not a space where we have to shop our way out of the problem by
Right.
buying a lot of stuff. There are things that we can buy: air filters, water filters, better products, better cleaning products. Etc. But there's also like just behavior change things that we can do. Open your windows, take your shoes off when you come inside. Always use the hood on your stove when you're cooking, especially if you have a gas stove. Or if you are like me, where my hood doesn't vent outside and it just blows up, which is the dumbest. And I hate very much, and I can't wait to reno my kitchen so that I can fix that. Open a window.
Right. Right.
Just
Yeah.
open the window when you're, like such small things like that can be hugely impactful for people. I think just kind of getting buy-in at that level
Right.
for people makes them feel like, oh, I can actually do something. They may not feel anything or notice anything, unless they have an acute respiratory issue or a chemical sensitivity that makes them, hypersensitive to these things. But open the windows, take off your shoes, vacuum and dust, like just the basics.
Simple, simple, simple. And
Yeah,
I relate this to the weight loss and exercise industry, where people are always looking for, and all of us, it's human nature. You want something that's fast and easy,
yeah,
and you want to trust somebody you're buying it from and say, all right, well, this looks like it's going to work. I'm going to buy this.
yeah,
Or maybe this health club was nicer. I can do more things, but we don't really use it.
yeah,
And so with healthy homes and living a healthier lifestyle within the home, sometimes, as you say, the easiest thing to do is the best. The first step is always the most difficult. And I
yeah,
find that so many of my clients have this disconnect. Like they think that if I take the first step and it's not
perfect.
perfect,
Yeah.
I'm going to make it worse.
Yeah. And perfect doesn't exist in this space at all. Like,
Correct.
I gave a talk last week and was explaining that, like, polar bears in the Arctic have PFAS chemistry in their blood, they have flame retardants in their blood. And it's just an example, not to highlight like a hopelessness feeling,
Hmm.
but rather that, like, there is no safe, quote unquote, air quotes, place where somebody can have a zero exposure. Like, that
Right.
ship sailed decades, if not 150 years ago.
Hmm.
Like, that is not a realistic goal. And so striving for it is just a setup for failure,
Yeah.
because we'll never get there. And so don't like, I know that in the wellness space, there's a lot of folks that love talking about like non toxic. And, yes, and if a specific item doesn't have any identified toxic chemicals in them, great. But the goal should be less, not
Right.
zero, because
Right.
zero is impossible. And so we're just aiming to lower our exposure wherever we can. There's not enough of these, but there is a decent amount of published research that's looking, through various lenses, at certain levels of chemicals in the bodies of couples that are trying to conceive.
Hmm.
And the folks that are at the high end of exposures have the worst outcomes, and the folks at the low end, not the zero end, at the low end, have the best exposures. So we just want to try to get at those low ends of exposures, and we do that by modifying the things that we buy, that we use, that we bring into our homes. I would feel extremely frustrated if I was working with somebody who just spent however many, hundreds of thousands plus dollars, $1 million on building a green home, and then gives no thought to the carpeting and the couch and, the scented candles because they want their new home to smell a certain way. Like, to me, that would be like the epitome of like, oh, like just deep core frustration
Sure.
of people not connecting the dots, like you were saying, not really realizing that there is no end to this effort. It
Right.
doesn't stop when the foundation is poured and the walls are up. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. And it's also, I find myself really having to show grace to my clients because, as they're talking, sometimes they're building this beautiful home and how they want to make it as healthy as possible, but they really got their eye on this cabinetry or this
Yeah.
carpeting material or whatever the case is. And I know it's not nearly the healthiest thing they could use. And
Yeah.
I'll say it once, and I'll say it,
Yeah.
if your goal is to build the healthiest home possible, that's not what you want to do. Then I hear, well, but,
Yeah.
you know, uh, we like this look and that look and it goes everything else, and the designer really wants us to go this way.
Yeah.
I've got to step back and say, this is your life, not mine. And
Yeah.
I will help guide you to the healthiest things possible. And if you still want to use aesthetic to trump everything else, obviously it's your life.
Yeah.
I'll answer questions for you. I'll be there to assist,
Yeah.
and understand I'm still just doing the best that I can.
Yeah, I mean, I remember having my version of that conversation probably in 20, I want to say it was in 2014, as it pertained to couches that didn't have flame retardants.
Yeah.
So most couches in the United States, unless they're manufactured locally in, Iowa or someplace that's not in California, contained a large amount of flame retardant chemicals per California law. And when they changed that law, it kind of opened the doors to more manufacturers, but to produce without requiring, they didn't, the law changed so that flame retardants were no longer required, although they still could be used. They just needed to be disclosed. That's since changed again since, with California essentially banning the use of almost all flame retardants. That's great. But before that law changed in 2014, in 2013, but it kind of went into effect in 2014, you could find flame retardant free couches. They were all like one style.
Mm.
And if you had like a certain aesthetic, if you were looking for like a mid-century style, good luck. You could not find, you'd have to get something custom made, which then costs thousands. And so I had this conversation with like a lot of my clients in terms of the aesthetic. It's like, which is more important to you? And so I held on to my, cheapo Sears couch, whatever, wherever I bought it from, that I knew had flame retardants in it until, like, I don't think I bought a new couch until 2015 because I was waiting for old inventory to move through. I was waiting for more companies to adopt a flame retardant free policy so that I could find a couch that I liked. So like
Mhm.
it's a real conversation that people have to battle with their aesthetic and what they like. In 10 or 20 years, I think we'll have more materials that are better and safer, that have a wider variety of aesthetic.
Mhm.
But in the beginning, when newer materials are coming out, safer building materials or safer, whether it's tiles or flooring or couches or carpeting or whatever, that there'll be more variety for people to choose from. But yeah, I remember having that conversation and being like, well, these are the four companies that I know that are making them, and I don't like any of them. If you like them, great, but I don't.
Yeah,
So
I see it's typically about a 15 to 20 year incubation period on that. And what I mean
yeah,
by that is, I remember in the early 90s, when I first got started, I had two manufacturers that I could work with to know that the materials that they make are healthier for the occupants.
yeah,
AFM Safecoat out of
yeah,
California and Forbo out of, I think they're based in Switzerland, but Forbo Natural Linoleum. And those are the two materials I dealt with in building materials for the first
yeah.
few years in business. Today, I have
So
well
many.
over 1,500 different products that I deal with on a
Yeah,
regular basis, and there are choices galore. But I
yeah,
still get calls. What about furniture? And
yeah,
I say the same thing. Just wait a bit. You know,
yeah.
give it some time. Manufacturers will respond, but they need enough of us to reach out and say, can you make this flame retardant free, Green Guard Gold certified, and maybe
Yes.
some nicer patterns?
Yes, yeah, and I think that like consumers, we go online and we don't see what we like, so we just move on. But I think we should be using that sort of power as consumers to make our voices heard. And then going back to the kind of the triage to just use the example of a couch, to me, the primary thing to be concerned about has long been flame retardants. Well, flame retardants are systematically being phased out of use. It's optional. And so, it used to be a selling tactic, like, oh, yeah, of course. And now companies are like, no, 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 we don't do that. And so, that if that box is ticked, meaning they are flame retardant free, then the next item on the list is the fabric treated with PFAS?
Right.
Is it stain resistant? And sometimes, you have to ask kind of digging, annoying questions to the manufacturer, because they'll say, we don't treat the fabric. But
Right.
was the fabric treated when you bought it? You
Mm-hmm.
now have to go back to your manufacturer and ask that question. Because I think that, and then if you really want to get into it, then the next layer is like, well, what's the frame made out of? And what
Right.
kind of glues? Like, you can kind of take this stuff to very, is the fabric, I wanted a couch when I moved here. I had mold in a previous home, so I had to like sell and rebuy like furniture a couple of times, which was just exhausting and really
Right.
expensive. And
Expensive.
so when I moved here, I was like, I gotta do it again. And the company that I really liked discontinued the color of the fabric that I really wanted. So
Mm.
I had to go search around, and I didn't want anything with flame retardants, and I didn't want anything with PFAS. And the concession that I had to make is that the fabric on my couch is not a natural fiber. It is polyester, or whatever. It's shedding microplastics right into my home at all hours of the day. And that was a concession that I had to make. And so, just another example of like, I'm not a perfectionist. I'm gonna do the best you canist, if we want to call it something.
Well, and that's a real healthy way to approach it, because again, you're gonna I would tell people, you drive yourself to the poorhouse or the nut house trying
Yes.
to find perfection. It's not possible. So choose your battles.
Yeah.
Understand that something as simple as a couch, if you love the look of it, if you love the feel of it, the color's perfect, it's the piece you wanted. And every morning or every night you come home from work and you sit down on that couch and you start reading a book and you just love the couch. That, to me, that's actually a healthy home attribute.
Yes, yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that that's where, and I understand it, this desire to do it right, right? To be perfect and to make sure that you're not missing anything. But that also, I think, taps into one, people's, again, inability to kind of triage or to contextualize, like, how big of a deal is this exposure versus all of these other things that I'm doing.
Right.
And I'm very much of a change the things you can control, worry less about the ones that you can't control. Because, like, I drive a car. Is the interior of my vehicle have flame retardants? Yes, because all vehicles are required to have that.
Mm-hmm.
Is the steering wheel faux leather made of PVC that likely has phthalates and lead in it? Yes. But, like, I'm not a Luddite. I live in a place where it's wide and dispersed, and you need a vehicle to get around. And so
Mm-hmm.
I choose to just not worry about it. Like,
Right.
it's just,
And if you had a specific sensitivity that you knew, if I touch PVC, I'm going to get some type of a skin reaction. If I
yeah,
touch this, or if I'm around this, that's a different story, of course.
yes,
Obviously, we
yes,
avoid the things we know that may be harmful to us acutely, but
yes.
overall, we can't stop living life.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that can help people kind of notch down that anxiety of feeling like they have to do everything, and that they can't touch things that are made of plastic or PVC, if assuming they don't have some type of acute response, is that on individual exposures, whether it's like BPA from a cash register receipt, or getting stuck in an Uber with a driver who has air fresheners in there and it smells really strong. Like, everybody's had that, not a unique experience.
Mm.
Like, those types of exposures that we get, those don't matter. in the grand scheme of things. They literally don't matter. Many of the chemicals that we're exposed to, certainly not all, definitely not PFAS, but many of the chemicals that we're exposed to are non-persistent. They don't build up in our bodies. And we can metabolize and pee them out usually within 6 to 12, maybe 24 hours. That's great. That's our body's doing what it's supposed to do. And our exposure is constant. So the levels in our body are constant. And that's why lowering our exposure is so important here. But I think that, you know, these individual exposures aren't what we're concerned about. It is the totality of exposures over decades, over a lifetime that matters. There is a relatively newer field of research called exposomics, and exposomics is looking to kind of assess this totality of exposure. We're not exposed to one chemical at a time, yet that's typically how they're studied.
Hmm.
We're exposed to hundreds of chemicals in our daily lives in conjunction with stress, with poor diet, with all of these other lifestyle factors and socioeconomic factors and geolocation factors, like where do you live? Do you live in an area with high air pollution and a little green space? That contributes to stress on its own that might weaken your body's ability to better handle other exposures that we get. So like it's this really complicated matrix, but that research is looking at the totality of our exposures over a lifetime. And so if we remember that this is a long game,
Hmm.
and that the individual exposures, again, excluding the individuals that have a severe multiple chemical sensitivity or acute reaction, like asthma or allergies or migraine response to fragrances, for example, don't sweat the small stuff, right? Like the
Hmm.
small stuff isn't the big deal. We have to live our lives. I think about this for people who eat out at restaurants. Like if you saw what happened in the back of a kitchen where all of the containers for food are polycarbonate plastic, which likely all have BPA in them, that they're using large canned ingredients in certain places. Like someone's making a tomato sauce, they're not mashing tomatoes,
Hmm.
unless you're going to high end restaurants, maybe they are. And so I eat out. I eat out with the full knowledge that that happens in the back of the kitchen, but it's a choice that I'm making to
Right.
do the best that I can at home. And then everything else, I have to live my life and enjoy life, and I don't want to be in a prison. My joke is always people want to live in a plastic bubble, and then I always say, "What type of plastic? And is it off-gassing?" Like you can't escape. You just can't escape it entirely. So, I think when people kind of look through the lens that this is a long game,
Hmm.
and what we're trying to do is just reduce what we can where we can over time, it gives a little bit more grace for those incidental exposures that we can't do anything about and just like not worry about it.
Yeah, I think that old adage that we should take everything in moderation
Yeah,
and understand that in the last few years, since the COVID pandemic, we're spending more time indoors than we ever used to.
yeah,
It's now estimated to be over 90% of our lives indoors.
yeah,
And so we could certainly go on and on and on about indoor air quality in homes. But I mean, if you just look at it and say, uh, to your point from just a few moments ago, open your window once in a while to get some fresh
yeah,
air. Walk outside to get some fresh air.
yeah,
Get away from the modern conveniences once in a while to sort of reset the body. Take your shoes off and walk in the grass.
yeah,
All these simple, free things that you can do to help reset the body. And I understand that so many of our listeners who have developed chemical sensitivity have developed it because of low level exposure over a
yeah,
long period of time. And all of a sudden
yeah,
their internal 55-gallon drum starts running over and they can't
right,
stop it. That's a
right,
different story. I
yeah,
think what we're talking about is just the average everyday consumer who might be overwhelmed because just thinking of where do I start and what do I do, and the anxiety created with those
hmm,
questions is probably worse than what they're
yeah.
trying to protect against.
Yeah, I fully agree with that, and it's also why, as somebody who's active on social media and see sees other content creators or whatever people talking about environmental toxicity online, 75% of what I see is overhyped, overstated science. It's fear mongering, it's sensational, and it just adds to the anxiety that exists in this space. And it's infuriating for me because, just to your point, like stress contributes to 80% of chronic illness. And we are already living in incredibly stressful times, with a surfeit of information coming at us 24/7 from all corners of the globe. It's a lot. And so I do take a lot of issue with how people communicate about environmental exposures online. I recognize that the sensationalist take, is the currency of social media. Like, it's
Hmm.
how that works. It gets engagement. We know that misinformation travels faster than fact. We know that negative, reactive comments are more popular than positive, reactive comments. And so there
Hmm.
is this machine that's feeding this anxiety. And that, I feel like, is, more and more over the years that I have been doing this work, I feel like that's actually a big part of the job,
Yeah.
is to contextualize the topic,
Hmm.
with the aim of lowering or tempering anxiety that people have.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because it's something on my list to discuss, and I love your approach, especially on your Instagram posts. And I recall one from, I don't know, it was maybe a few weeks ago, and somebody mentioned something about so and so tested the lead levels of my favorite
Yes.
matcha tea,
Yes.
and you got back and like, I still drink it, I love it. This is, I mean, so maybe several months ago, I had an electromagnetic field expert on the show, and I asked him. I said, you know, um, what do we do? Well, all these different topics, and he said, he looks at me and said, humans are dealing with something that we've never dealt with in the history of time until the last 100 plus years. All of a sudden, we have electromagnetic fields from electricity, from cell phones, and so forth. We never had that for since the dawn of time. We've only had the pull of the Earth's core and the sun and the moon. Now all of a sudden we're dealing with this man-made electromagnetic field issue. He goes, "You're not going to get away from it."
Yeah.
So unless you have a very specific sensitivity to it, and I understand that, I have a lot of clients that do, but don't make this the hill you die on
Yeah.
when you're choosing materials, because if you walk outside, you're going to get hit with everything you're trying to protect yourself against, and it's not going to hurt you.
Yeah.
Humans are evolving, but it's going to take a lot longer for us to
Yeah.
fully evolve. And I see that with things like, heavy metals in tea, and heavy metals get in tea because they're grown in the ground, and there's heavy metals in the ground, so they're going to be
Well,
there.
I think that also circles back to that sort of perfectionism purity goal, is people don't understand, right? They don't have the context to understand, like, these metals are in every single thing that you eat, and the bigger context matters. So, like, in regard to the matcha tea thing, yeah, there's a small amount of lead in matcha tea, and you have to use the correct framework to kind of look at those levels. The person who had posted about it that I was kind of responding to, was using like a baby food,
Mm.
recommendation of, like, this level is safe, but that's baby food. That level never got adopted. It was proposed,
Hmm.
and it's like, well, matcha tea is not a baby food.
Right.
It's not for babies, and the quantity consumed matters, and also the nutrients that are in that matcha tea can afford a net benefit, even in the face of a lead exposure.
Hmm.
And so this purity, this sort of Puritan, it has to be 100% non-toxic and zero metals. People in the comments on that post were kind of arguing with me that, like, I'm not going to eat any food that has lead in it, and that should not be acceptable. And I'm like, yes, I hear you in an ideal world,
Hmm.
but we don't live in an ideal
But good
world. We live in
luck,
this
right?
one. And, like, you'll be left drinking nothing but reverse osmosis water and consuming air that
Hmm.
would assumingly be filtered because there are trace metals found in air, right? And this is that, like, it's not realistic and it's
Right.
lacking the context that we need to be having this conversation in. We know, for example, that like some of the nutrients that are found in fruits and vegetables, chlorophyll, in same thing in matcha tea, can actually bind to and help excrete metals. So they might even cancel themselves out in
Mm.
terms of potential harm, but that research hasn't been done. And so we can't, terrible expression, throw away the baby with the bathwater. We can't just pick this insignificant exposure and make it be this big boogeyman without the bigger context of that exposure. If somebody's drinking matcha tea regularly, I guarantee, because it's expensive and it's not a sort of typical food that people in the United States consume,
Mhm.
my hunch is that they generally are going to be a healthier person who is willing to spend more money on healthy foods. Therefore, they're probably doing better than most Americans. 90% of women in this country and 97% of men in this country don't get enough fiber in their diet. 90% don't eat fruits and vegetables or get their basic, requirements for fruits and vegetables. That's where we need to start,
Right.
right? In
Right.
terms of people's overall health. Now, obviously, the subset of people in your audience don't know where they lie on the food spectrum, but obviously they're drawn to a green building either from a sustainability perspective, which is so important, and as I'm sure you encounter, sustainability and health don't always
No.
fully align.
No.
And so there's so much nuance, and frankly, I love the nuance. I think the nuance is the most interesting part.
Well, I think so too, and that's I've always been a proponent of allowing people to choose what is best for them and for
Yeah,
their family and their situation. You see behind me this sign that says health. Many years ago, I developed a program called Degree of Green, which I found that there are 27 different reasons why you can call a building material or a home good quote unquote green. You
yeah,
boil those 27 reasons down to three main categories: human health, environment health, and
yes,
sustainability.
yeah,
And they are three distinctly different tracks.
yep,
And I have three different types of customers that reach out. Now, most of them are reaching out because of health issues.
yeah,
On the other hand, I have many people that will call up and say, I have a client right now that says, yes, we are dealing with a situation. My wife has got chronic inflammatory response because of mold exposure, but we want to build a home that's going to be here 100 years from now. We want to make this the most sustainable home we can afford.
right, yeah,
And so now we're hitting two of those three legs. We're never going to get the
yeah,
third because
yeah,
it's impossible. You
yep,
can really only choose two out of the three. But it, again, allows people that choice. And I think a lot of the materials that we deal with on a daily basis, we have to make that decision. It's like,
yeah,
do I care if this product is made from recycled glass or recycled metal because it's better for the environment? No, I like it because it's non-toxic, or
right,
vice versa.
right.
And both are right.
Yeah, I mean, I've had this conversation with, anything that's made out of recycled plastics, and people are like, "It's more sustainable," and I'm like, "Is it
Yeah.
actually?" Um, I would argue it's actually not. It's
Mhm.
just delaying
The inevitable. Yeah.
problem, right? It's
Right.
just delaying and pushing it out towards later. It's like when there, I don't know if this moved forward or not, but there were some cities that were looking at grinding up plastic waste and putting them in asphalt mixtures
Hmm.
as a way to sustainably, reduce plastic waste. And
Sure.
I'm going, every time it rains, those chemicals in the plastics in the asphalt are now going to run off the road into the waterways.
Hmm.
And then that's just a problem. Like, I'm sure you're familiar with Annie Leonard's Story of Stuff book that she
Hmm.
published a decade plus ago. And, I remember when that book came out, I went to go see her speak at the 92nd Street Y in New York City. When the book came out, I loved it. And in that book, she talks about the myth of away. Like, there is no away. When you throw something away, away isn't a place. Away is just not here. And so we're always putting these things someplace else, but the someplace else is where other people live.
Right.
And so there's and this is we're in a global marketplace now. And so we have to be really thoughtful about the materials, and upcycling or downcycling plastic is not a sustainable measure,
No, you're
in my
kicking the can
opinion.
down the road. That's
Yes.
all you're doing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're kicking the can. And so, like, that conversation about, recycled plastic being a good thing is like, I try to, again, contextualize that in a bigger conversation, and ask, like, is it better? I mean, this is where the whole topic of, flame retardants found in black plastic, whether it's a kitchen utensil or anything else, is rooted in. There's been, there was one paper that kind of made a big splash at the end of last year, but there's not the first paper. There's lots of other research on this. And this is a problem because, companies are recycling electronic waste, the shell casings of laptops and TVs and computers that have flame retardants in them, grinding them up and recycling them into kids' toys or kitchen spatulas.
Yeah.
And so, like, that is just an example of the hubris of kind of hanging your hat on recycling as a
Right.
solution to that problem. It's not. There are consequences.
Well, it's like the unintended consequence of trying to do the right thing sometimes.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so I saw this in the 2000s when compact fluorescent light bulbs came out, and
Yeah.
it's the big push to use CFLs in lieu of incandescents.
Yeah.
And then we
Unless they
found within
break,
years, I
and
mean,
then there's mercury everywhere.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly right. Um, you know, I got into an argument with somebody from Focus on Energy because I said, well, what happens if you drop a compact fluorescent bulb on your floor? And he says, it's just the tip of this pen. That's how much mercury gets released. I go, okay, but if you drop that on a carpeted floor and it breaks, the state of Maine did this research years ago that said that you have to replace the carpet. There's no way to get it out.
Yeah. Yeah.
So now you're spending two
Also,
thousand dollars.
yeah. And
You
it's also, technically, if you break a fluorescent bulb, you're supposed to call, like, the fire department
right,
hazmat cleanup. People don't know that. I've
right.
seen like TikTok trends of people breaking the long tube
Oh,
fluorescent light,
geez.
over someone's back and laughing. And I look at that and I'm like, oh my God,
Right.
that is so dangerous from so many different levels.
Hmm.
Forget about the, like, paper thin shards of glass that are just micro glass everywhere. Forget about
Right.
that. Forget about inhaling glass dust.
Oh.
You're also inhaling mercury vapors and absorbing it through your skin. Like, anyway, so, like, yeah, and there is a short sightedness
Hmm.
with a lot of material production that I think would benefit tremendously from, like, a more holistic view of, like, well, let's get a toxicologist, an environmental health scientist, somebody who understands the fate of materials in soil, in air, in water, so that we, really just leaning on green chemistry
Hmm.
as a solution. And for people that aren't familiar, green chemistry is essentially a sort of subset of the chemistry movement that seeks to avoid a lot of these problems by ensuring that the chemical molecules that are created by chemists, these novel chemicals that didn't exist before, don't have health impacts, don't have environmental impacts, don't have toxicity impacts, whatever. Um, uh, at the end of their lifespan, or when they, or, do these chemicals migrate out? Do they cause harm? And it's thinking through that lens, which traditional chemistry doesn't do. They're just looking for functionality of and durability of the chemistry. So I think it would take a a large and dramatic shift to get more viewpoints on board
Hmm.
at the table, so that somebody who's like has the genius idea of putting ground up plastic and asphalt can present that, and somebody else can go, actually, huge red flag, and
Hmm.
here's why. But all of those voices need to be at the table,
Well, and
and they're
this is why I'm
not
such a
heard.
big fan of allowing the sort of the free market to help decide, not be the end all be all, because it has to be regulation within that, but and not forcing things down the consumer's throat because some group or somebody said this is the way to go. And I
Yeah,
saw that with the compact fluorescents. And I
yeah.
think that we could take that lesson to all aspects of consumer goods and building
Oh yeah,
materials to say, all right, there's more than one way to look at things.
yeah,
And maybe it's best if we have a larger group of people, of experts, of consumers weigh in on this and help us decide
yeah,
instead of forcing it down our throat. And then we find out the hard way, oops, we
yeah.
made the wrong decision.
Yeah, and I think that's pretty common. I would also throw another hat in that ring to say, building codes need to
Mm,
adapt so
yes.
that there's more variety of accessible materials that people can use that are to code. This conversation I just seen kind of play out after the LA fires and the Altadena fires there, where people are talking about there's a lot of traditional building techniques that produce fire resistant homes that don't require any of these toxic chemicals, but none of them are approved for building code. And maybe there's legitimate reasons why, and maybe it's just inertia, or maybe it's industry influenced. I don't know the answer. That's not my space.
Mm,
But it's interesting to just observe the sort of um, same roadblocks
mm-hmm.
in that space that exist in even just like the manufacturing of canned goods.
Yeah.
I was just emailing a client this morning that was asking me about BPA non intent labels. So, a lot of canned foods. So, most canned foods, almost all, are lined with some type of coating on the inside of the can so that the food doesn't touch the aluminum of the can, which can break down the aluminum and introduce the potential for something like botulism, which is deadly. So, the legitimate reason, an important reason why there's a can lining, is this just the materials of choice are like maybe not the best. And so the majority of cans use BPA. But because of the uproar about BPA being an endocrine disrupting chemical, can manufacturers have shifted over the last decade to BPA free cans. But then begs the question, well, what are you using if you're not using
Right.
BPA? And so some of them are what they're putting now, because of the supply chain thing that we talked about earlier, is BPA NI, which is non-intent, which they're saying we did not intentionally add BPA, but if you test this and you find BPA, it's not from us.
Not our,
We didn't
it's not,
do
yeah,
it.
not our fault.
It's not our fault. We did our best, and I understand that from a contamination process standpoint and a supply chain opacity standpoint. So they're like doing the best that they can, but that still doesn't mean that the BPA free or BPA NI can doesn't have BPS or BPF,
Hmm.
which are just as bad, if not worse, than these replacements. So people, they get lulled into this, oh,
Sense
it's
of
BPA
security,
free.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I get it, because we don't want to have to, read a 16-page report of the interior lining of cans. We just want
Hmm.
to go buy some food, eat it, we're tired, we don't want to do
Right.
this stuff. I
Hmm.
do this stuff because I find it interesting,
Right.
but for the most part people don't want to do this.
Right.
And so it's like, and then they feel duped. They
Right.
feel misled, which is exactly what has happened, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So going back to PFOA and PFAS chemicals, in particular, I see this with cookware all the time. So we have cookware companies that are producing non-stick cookware. And if you look at the labeling on the package or on their website, they say it's PFOA free and PFOS free. And somebody who's doesn't is not very informed on this topic is going to go, oh well, this is a better nonstick pan. because it's free of these things,
Hmm.
whatever these things are.
Right.
Well, no nonstick pan manufacturers are using PFOA or PFOS. Those were phased out of use in 2006, 2008. So nobody's using those things.
Right.
So it's just deceptive marketing. And they're still using PFAS chemicals. There's over 14,000 chemicals in that class,
Hmm.
most of which we don't know anything about.
Right.
And so it's like that type of um, deception in marketing and labeling of consumer goods is something that's not going to go away. They're just going to, move on to the next thing. And it's unfortunately at this point, in light of lack of good regulations from the government down, it's up to the consumer to like know this stuff.
Hmm.
And that's a big ask for people that are busy and overwhelmed with day to day living.
And that's why we have you.
I do
And
my,
that's
I,
why you do
yes,
what you do.
yes, to try to educate people. My clients are primarily health professionals that they themselves are working with individuals, in their practices, and it's just a more efficient way for me to sort of distribute the information than working. And that sort of came to that decision before the advent of Instagram,
Hmm.
and now I have direct access to 100,000 plus people who are interested in learning about it. And I think those social platforms can be good if you use them well.
That's
Um,
correct.
and
And you
that's
use
the
them very well, and are
I
and
try.
I know you have a very loyal following. It should be even bigger than it is, even though it's already big, and it will be
Yeah,
bigger. I am going to make sure to put all of your contact information and links into the show notes.
great.
I definitely want people to reach out to you, especially healthcare professionals, health professionals. You have some fantastic programs on your site that I'll
Yes,
definitely link to.
thank
I
you.
could go on and talk with you for hours, and I'm sure we will. I have a whole host of notes that I've taken about our next show. And
Great. I'm down. I'm down. I'm like, I still think about the conversation we had 2.5 years ago every time I pull into my garage because I never redid the floor in my garage because life.
Yep,
But trying to find a less toxic solution to an
that's right.
epoxy floor.
Yeah.
And,
Hey, we all do the best we can. That's all we can
best
ask.
that we can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. So,
Thank you so much for being on the show again today. And folks, again, please reach out and ask Lara how she can help you in your practice, in your everyday life, and follow her social all her platforms because just tons of great information. And thanks again for watching the show today or this week, folks. And Lara, thanks again for being on the show.
yeah. Thanks, Andy.
All right, take care.